Welcome to Crosscut Talks. I'm Paris Jackson, the host of Crosscut Now on KCTS 9, and the host for this podcast. Today we're talking about something we use every day, plastic. Plastic is everywhere, in our world and even in our bloodstreams. Seattle Times environment and climate editor Ben Woodard moderated a conversation with panelists. Washington State 36th District Representative Liz Berry, anthropologist Dr. Yoshitaka Oda, and Zero Waste Washington Executive Director Heather Trim in May at the Crosscut Ideas Festival in Seattle. Washington State was once revered for its recycling efforts in the nation. At its peak in 2011, Washingtonians recycled 56% of recyclable materials. But since then, there's been a decline, and now the state recycles about 49%. In this conversation, you'll learn why those numbers have dropped. The panelists say recycling is an equity issue with international and social implications. But there are solutions. A current legislative bill in Washington State aims to hold producers of goods accountable by having them pay for recycling services. The less plastic they put in packaging, the less they pay. You may be surprised by the myriad of current roadblocks to progressive solutions and the grip that keeps plastic reliance the way it is in the U.S. and around the globe. I hope you enjoy this engaging conversation. Please share your feedback on the podcast with us by sending it to talks@crosscut.com. Now let's get into it.
All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Crosscut Ideas Festival. My name is Ben Woodard. I'm an editor at the Seattle Times. I edit our environment coverage, work with reporters on assigning stories, and decide what our priorities are. Full disclosure, I'm very jealous of our folks in radio who this might come a lot more naturally to, me being a print journalist, but I'm really happy to be here and to be talking to our great panelists. It's a great day to talk about plastic. It's everywhere. It's in my kids' toys in a rainbow of colors, as I've learned, 2 kids under 3, so it's all over the house. It's in our cups, our cars, iPhones, computers, packed into our Amazon boxes. Amazon, thank you for hosting us, but it's getting a little much. It's truly pervasive and even in our bloodstreams. So today we're here to discuss the future of plastic in our world, already grappling with the effects of climate change. And I'm very excited to welcome our panelists here today. So to kick off our discussion, I'd like to talk about where things stand in Washington State in regards to plastics and recycling. Most folks in Seattle, I think we recycle, we place the things in the bins, right? It might be a little confusing of what all those numbers and symbols mean, but we tend to try to do our best. That's not the case across the state. Recycling rates they're actually down in recent years, which was something as I was researching this was surprising to me. In 2011, 56% of recyclable material was recycled, but more recently that rate has dropped to 49%, and it's getting even more expensive to pay for recycling services. Heather, it seems like people have a heightened awareness of the environment with climate change top of mind. So why are we so bad at recycling?
Great question. So in Washington, we were one of the best in the country. We were kind of revered as being one of the states that had one of the best recycling systems. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, the decline from the peak in 2011 from 56% down to less than 50% for our consumer recycling is due to the combination of things. So one is that the manufacturers keep changing the type of packaging you get. We used to have baby food in glass, and now it's in these plastic pouches, which cannot be recycled in our system. We had coffee in metal tins and then other things, and now it's in these, again, laminated pouches that cannot be recycled in our current system. So you have that factor. You also have a big factor, which people may not have been so aware of, which is for 2 decades, we were sending all of our waste to China. And it was cheap. It was cheaper to send a bale of mixed paper, mix of plastics, that kind of thing, to China by ship than by truck to Portland, Oregon. That was what the dynamic was. These were empty trucks, empty containers going back to China. So we had that dynamic, and then we just have the dynamic that the recycling system here in Washington hasn't really upgraded. And in fact, that's true for much of the world. We haven't really upgraded until now with new robots and new machinery and that kind of thing. So that's starting to happen now, but we did have a lag, and part of that was because we could send our waste to Southeast Asia.
So these global forces are at work. What happened? I think China was the principal export market for our trash. Like, what happened to make those things shift?
Well, and to be clear, it wasn't our trash. Our trash does go to the landfills here. It would not be cost effective to send our trash there. But unfortunately, what was going in those bales to China was between 14 and 20% contamination. So let's say you had a bale of plastic water bottles. In there would be metal, other plastics, food waste, and glass. And so when it would get to China or other countries in Southeast Asia, they would be sold to a lot of little mom and pop shops, as well as some big companies, and they would, in their backyard, take out the stuff they could sell, and then they had 20%, up to 20% that they were burning or dumping. So we were causing a massive pollution problem, and still are to some degree, but anyway, a massive pollution problem. And the Chinese government basically said, no more. We no longer, they enacted in 2018, they called it it's now called Blue Sky, China Blue Sky. And they said, we're gonna make it so that the bales coming in have to have 0.5%. That's not a typo, not 5%, 0.5% contamination. So that put a kibosh on our bales going to China. And now we have this reckoning that we need to basically clean up our recycling and do it here and do it a lot better.
How are we doing? Are we getting closer to that 0.5 contamination? It seems like that would be a pretty high bar.
Well, there is a facility in San Francisco that got to 1%. So they did improve their, they put in robots. They spent, I think, $7 million. They put in robots, they put in more staff, and they reconfigured. That's a recology facility in San Francisco. But really, as you all know, if you're putting your stuff in your bin, are you sure where it's going and what's really happening? A lot of the plastics are still very problematic, and that's the reason that we were looking to try to work with Liz Berry and Senator Rolfes to do a bill to really revamp our recycling system in Washington.
That's great. We're going to come back to the bill and Washington and sort of the U.S. Regulatory discussion soon. I wanted to bring Yoshi in because I wanted to broaden our discussion out a little bit as we're talking about this being a global problem, and it's similar to climate change in a lot of ways. I hadn't done a lot of work like at the Times with reporters on plastic issues, but now we do a lot on climate change. But it's a very similar issue in that things are happening locally, but the effect is global, and so solutions have to be really big. Could you tell us a little bit about your research and the people that you've worked with and met in these communities that are like on the front lines of this pollution?
Thank you, Ben. I work with Heather and a couple other people, but the reason why I'm invited here, last year in November, we produced this report which considers plastic issues as an equity issue rather than technology issue, rather than consumer behavior issues, rather than corporate responsibility issues. So what do I mean by equity issues? Like anything else, those pollutions, and it's not marine litter, it's a marine pollution. We shouldn't really talk about the litter. It's not waste management, it's a pollution. It is pollution because it will go somewhere else and then it will actually affect somebody else's life. So I produced this report working with different people in the different places. I worked with Ghana, Malaysia, Japan, Washington State, and a couple of New Zealand, and many places. And the fact is, you throw the plastic and we used to go to China. And then China shut down, where does it go? Does it come back to us? No, it goes somewhere else. It goes to Southeast Asia, or it goes to Africa. And then they have to clean up. Do they have a capacity to clean up? Absolutely not. So it's very similar to climate change. In some ways, those who actually started these issues are not really sort of getting this burden. But those who actually didn't really start or doesn't really have so much of responsibility in this issue like climate change are really the first one who's going to be affected. And it is justice issues. is really what we need to think about it. We shouldn't really just talk about the symptom, which is basically where the rubbish goes, how much we need to reduce. But we should really also consider about like, turn off the tap. Where did it come from? Let's close it, let's reduce it. So that's what I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have this perspective represented so clearly on the panel. And we see plastic in our lives. In other places in the world, it actually is interfering with people's livelihoods. What are some of the places that you've interacted with where you've seen that on the ground affecting fisheries or people, being the plastic being just a part of an economy? Like, how does that impact people's families?
Clearly, we tend to think ocean is a place where people don't really live, but we live on the ocean. There are fishermen, there's people living in the coast, and then people who loves clean beach. There's tons of people in Washington State who clean up the beach every week, and it is just so disheartened. And then I do believe, people tend to think, okay, how much is a number produced and how much is a recycle, how much, let's sort it out with numbers. But there is a conversation needed to happen, which is respect people's feelings and dignity, You're just picking up the rubbish every week and it just comes and then they know it's gonna stay. It's gonna stay for new generations. It will stay in the ice, it will stay in the ocean, it will come back to you. And then that's really the issues. Fishermen in Ghana, tourist operator in Japan, outer island, every single one of them, I just really feel so bad about seeing plastic every single day, whatever they do. So that's what really hurts people. It's not really about the money only, but I think it's dignity, which is more expensive than something we can pay for.
Yeah, we'll come back to solutions. I think actually we'll get there now. It's such I think Rep. Berry, most people will agree that there's too much plastic. Like, it's everywhere. It's causing so many issues around the world. Washington, the state legislature, has taken some steps to, over the past couple of years, introduce legislation that would change the burden of cleaning up plastic and recycling plastic, and put that on the manufacturer. And this is the WRAP Act, which we talked about, the Washing, Recycling, and Packaging Act. Very clever.
Catchy, right?
Yeah, very nice, very nice. Could you tell us about this idea of that shift in sort of responsibility?
Yeah, so we introduced a bill this year called the WRAP Act that is called a producer-led model for recycling services. So it's called Extended Producer Responsibility, EPR. You might hear that term a lot. 4 states in our country have already passed that, and you see EPR programs in all of Canada, in most of Europe, and this is clearly the model we're going towards, which is making sure that producers pay for recycling services, and with that cost, the less packaging waste they produce, the less they pay into the system. So it incentivizes them to not have to have that toy without the plastic wrap, but maybe inside the cardboard box. It's way more recyclable. So we had introduced a bill over this last session to we've been doing it now for several years. And it's been a very powerful lobby against the bill that has made it very challenging to do this. And this year, we got the closest we've ever gotten, which is all the way to the House floor. But there are 3 reasons why it's been so challenging to get this bill passed. I think the first reason is that regular people like us don't realize that our recycling has actually declined in the last decade. You, as good citizens, put your goods in the recycling bin and you expect them to be recycled. Well, 50% of those materials are being landfilled. That's shocking when people hear that. And so legislators, I believe, were not aware that this was happening and that their constituents' recycling materials were not going where they were supposed to go. Under the bill, we asked producers to also subsidize the cost of curbside recycling for everywhere that you pick up garbage in Washington State. Well, that's free recycling for all of our constituents. And I think that was another point that legislators didn't really know was in the bill, and once they learned, were more interested in that. The second way we've come into a lot of challenge getting this bill passed is a very powerful business lobby that likes the way things operate now and doesn't want to pay more to clean up the system. But I believe that attitude is shifting, certainly with the companies that act in a more multinational arena, because they have seen this kind of program work in other countries and in the other states where we have EPR programs, but they also know that their consumers, people like us, want them to do better. And so because that will affect their bottom line ultimately, they want to be a part of the conversation and not have us do something to them. They want to be at the table while we're writing the legislation. And then the third factor that's been very challenging for this bill is the Waste Hauling Association. So the folks that collect our recycling garbage at the curb, they don't like the way that we have set up an EPR program because they like the idea of the producers funding the system. They don't like the idea of the producers having any part of control in how that system's run. They see that as a lack of control that's being taken from them. And many of them own landfills. Many of these waste hauler associations and waste hauler companies own the landfills themselves. So 50% of the recyclable materials are going to their landfills. That's a pretty good deal for them. So this has been an incredible barrier that we've faced trying to get this kind of legislation passed now. I think this is like the 4th year you've tried to do it. But I think every year we get closer and closer with more education and socializing the concept. And as you can tell right here, it's a really complicated bill. It's a complicated system to explain to people. And so once we can break it down, I think more and more legislators are getting on board that this is something that we need to get behind.
Yeah, talking about complicated issues, in 2021, the legislature did pass the Climate Commitment Act, which was, for those who don't know, essentially set up I'll call it a carbon pricing program just because it's kind of a clear way to talk about it. It's also referred to as cap and invest, but this is related to greenhouse gas emissions in the state. Just this year, this program came online. There was an auction, the first quarterly auction was held, and it raised $300 million from polluters themselves. So these are companies and institutions that are required to participate in this program, and there's varying levels of allowances that are given out. But essentially, if you're polluting in Washington State, you're paying into a state fund, and that money can then be spent by the legislature to help further offset greenhouse gases. And just thinking about the complexity of that, I'll tell you, being the editor on a story that we wrote about this specific program, it took us a long time to figure out and wrap our heads around and meet with these polluters themselves, including the University of Washington is one of these institutions paying into this program, to understand the complexity of the issues, how ingrained they are into our systems, and how it just takes so much to unravel some of that, systemic problems. So do you see something similar here where it may take some time? I know California, Maine, Oregon have had some success in passing legislation like this. Do you see that coming?
Yes, so I think it's, again, it's educating folks that we have a problem because people think that they're doing right by the system. We're doing what we've been told to do, right? We put the things in the bin. I also utilize in my household a service called Ridwell that picks up the plastic film and the light bulbs and the batteries, but that's the privilege I have to pay for that system, right? To come to my door and do that every month. And so people don't realize that we are living in a huge trash problem, a plastics problem, a single-use plastics problem that isn't going to get better if we don't do something radical to change it. And so what's exciting about the EPR model is that more and more businesses coming on board because they understand that they want to be part of the solution, not the problem. And if they don't come to the table, we're going to do something to them that they probably like even worse than what EPR will do. The other element of the bill that I was really proud of was a bottle deposit system, bringing that here to Washington. So states with bottle deposit systems, and there are about a dozen of them, I think 10 of them, they have between a 65 and 85% recycling rate for their single-use plastic bottles. States like Washington have a 28%. We know that if we want to do better by these recyclable materials and get them into the circular economy, that a bottle deposit incentivizes behavior of people like us to redeem our bottles for that 10 cents. And that was also a very difficult concept. Washington's been on the ballot several times. It's been, legislators have been talking about for 50 years, but it's just one of those things that people are nervous about pulling the trigger on because it's change, and people are worried about, I think, upsetting their constituencies and the communities that they represent, that this is more of a burden for them. But I think that if we want to save our planet for our kids and our grandkids, we should be concerned about taking on more burden to make sure that these materials are ending up where they should.
And Heather, you work with a lot of folks in different communities in Washington. How has that, has there been a shift in the discourse over recycling and plastics that you've seen in the past few years, would you say?
Absolutely. So I worked on the Seattle bag campaign back in 2009, and then prior to that, helping ban styrofoam in Seattle. We had a group called Foam Free Seattle. When we were working at that point, people looked us straight in the face and said, "Why are you working on such a trivial issue?" Plastics was just considered not an issue back then. And we didn't know that we had this, or most people didn't know that we had this huge gyre in the North Pacific that had little bits of plastic floating through it. And we didn't know about, and I think it was already happening in Southeast Asia, people in America were really unaware of the impacts we were having in other countries. So in the last 10 years, there's been a massive amount of public awareness. And when we go around and talk about plastics and excess packaging, there is an overwhelming response from the public. They are fed up, from what we can tell.
We'll be back with more after this.
At Amazon, there's a way up for anyone because there's something for everyone. Like Jessica, who completed free technical training programs and is getting her bachelor's with Amazon's prepaid tuition.
Even if you have no knowledge or no experience in IT, Amazon has the tools and the resources to teach you. I've been promoted 3 times, and it's been a significant boost in pay for me.
Free technical training programs at Amazon move full-time and part-time employees into higher-paying jobs. Visit aboutamazon.com for more info.
So you mentioned the Pacific garbage patch, which I think sort of came into vogue maybe a few years ago, but is a consistent problem. Yoshi, why can't we just clean it up? Can't we just get out there and scoop it all up? What's going on here?
So we can. Plastic is kind of like an easy one. And I'm just going to bring a little bit optimistic with, bringing some negative things about it. I mean, plastic, we can clean up. I've seen beaches clean up completely, with like 50 people, volunteers for like 2 weeks. And so it's possible. The problem is, we're talking about ocean, right? So it's from the surface all the way down to the bottom. So all the plastic, micro, nano, just goes all the way down to the bottom, and it will just bring up by the fish and some other things, and it will come back to us. So it's just really hard to completely clean up, but we can make some effort to it. So, but just gyre thing, that's a myth. It's unfortunately everywhere. And we do know about this because we've seen plastic everywhere when we go to the ocean. And one thing I want to say, we have a mercury, we have a PFAS. There are lots of pollution going on in the ocean, which is much more severe because we can't see them. Plastic, just about we can still see it. So let's really act on it. It's really hard, but it's something solvable, I think.
Can I add to this? People say, why can't you just scoop it out? Why can't you just sieve it out? And the main reason is because if you do that, you're also sieving out all the wildlife, the plankton, the larvae. So you do not want to go in and just take all the biology, the good things out of the ocean.
Yeah, I've read about this. There's like almost an ecosystem among the plastic and other garbage.
Well, that's true too, but there's also a lot of the good things in the ocean that you don't want to clean up. What we have to do with a problem like this is turn off the tap.
Yes.
That's the issue. You can't just go in and clean it up. It's turning it off the tap, and that's what the RAP Act and all these other plastics legislation would do.
Thank you.
Great. So yeah, I guess, I'm thinking back to like growing up. It's like, oh, recycle, right? Just recycle your plastic and your bottles, put it in the bin. I think growing up in Snohomish County, just north of King County here, we might have had 3 different bins where we'd sort the paper and the bottles and the plastic. This idea of this personal burden, right? I think there's a shift in the thinking around this, but I think that everyone maybe here in the audience would want to know like what they could do to affect change. Rep Barry, maybe you could talk to us about like what should the individual be doing to help make a cleaner world?
Well, I'm going to plug my bill here. You should, yes. I'll tell you this, there wasn't one legislator in the state of Washington who got a negative piece of mail from a constituent about supporting the RAP Act. It was from the lobbyists at the doors to the House chamber telling them this was a horrible idea. So I would encourage all of you, if you don't already know who your legislators are, and maybe I'm one of yours out there, you're in Queen Anne, Magnolia Ballard, yay! Write them and say, look, I just heard about this bill called the RAP Act. I heard it had a fiery death last year. Well, I want you to vote for it, and this is why. And get them excited about this bill and tell them that not only will it help our recycling rates, but it'll, again, turn off the tap, which is what we want to do, because it will incentivize producers and manufacturers to produce less of the waste that you all get and don't know what to do with. So that's what I would say, is get involved at a policy level with trying to make change, because it is really a travesty to me that there are only 4 states in our country that have implemented a policy like this. And I would say the one that we wrote is the strongest in the country and was being looked at as a model for other states because of how all-encompassing and it really was. So that would be one thing I would do. And join a local group that picks up trash in your community. If you have young kids or young grandkids out there, my family loves doing that, and they learn a lot about how to protect and be good stewards of our environment as well. So what about you? I'm sure you all have good ideas too.
Well, the number one thing that I say to people when they say, what can I do to be a good person in terms of the topic of zero waste, is don't buy it in the first place. If you don't need a plastic water bottle, bring your own bottle, use a glass. If you're only going to use something once, borrow it from someone. If you have something that's old, repair it. And when it comes to single-use packaging, which is a large part of the plastic problem that we're talking about, bring your own container, ask your restaurant to give it to you in a compostable container you can put in your compost bin if you're in Seattle, and hopefully soon statewide. And or bring your own container, or have them give you a reusable container. So there are a lot of good solutions out there just to reduce the waste in the first place. And then, of course, we definitely want and need support for the legislative bills.
The legislature did pass something related to plastic use this session,
oh, yeah.
right? Is that
Charlotte's bill?
Regarding in hotels,
yes.
Single-use plastics.
We love that bill. Go ahead, Heather.
I'll
talk about that, and then I'll talk about, or what Liz Berry talked about, her bill from 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So the plastic pollution reduction bill, which was HB 1085, was led by Charlotte Mena, who was a brand new legislator, very great legislator. It does 3 things. It requires refill stations. So when you have a water faucet in new construction in the state building code, so wherever the water faucets are required, a refill station is required, so you can refill your bottle. It bans the little toiletries, the mini toiletries, the shampoos and conditioners and things like that at our hotels. And it requires that those styrofoam docks that are getting all those little bits of styrofoam all over the state waters are that we can't have those flimsy ones, and that a study of the hard shell ones. That's a little bit of a complicated issue. But then 5022, which was passed a couple of years ago, which Liz worked on, does more styrofoam and other things.
Mm-hmm. Ban styrofoam, and also we oppose consumer recycled content. So part of what makes a bill like the RAP Act successful is making sure that there's an end market, a circular market for those products once they're recycled. And so when we mandate certain products have post-consumer recycled content in them, it builds that circular economy. And so the bill, the RAP Act, also expands upon the products that must require that, in addition to truth in labeling, so that item you have actually, if it has the arrows, it actually is recyclable. It puts together also a statewide list. So if you go to Spokane, it's the same list as here in Seattle, which we also think is a huge deal to helping clean up the systems.
And that reminded me of something I learned researching for this, was that most of Washington, most of the counties do not have recycling services.
Right. Oh, curbside, certainly. I mean, in Olympia, you can't recycle glass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing. Yoshi, can we get philosophical maybe? Okay.
I'm not really, but
we've been talking about, how we can change our personal behavior, but is there something about the way we think about plastic that we ought to change?
It's not really something individual behavioral change can do, and people tend to use that narrative just to put the pressure on people were not really responsible. I said similar sort of things. But, whenever I think about plastic, what I'm really what I imagine is this one kid who's he's a Bajau group who's a sea nomad in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. They move around and just like a nomad, and he just clean up ocean, who's right next to the eco tourism village, and they sell those rubbish to the recycle shop and make some money. I just always think about what can I do for the kid, And then that's all what I think. And there is a negotiation in United Nations coming up in about a couple of weeks. So I'm going to send a couple of people and then we're going to talk about it. But this is what it is. I mean, we tend not to care if it's somebody else's, relatives or something. But we care if it's just happening right here. We just got to change their mindset because our plastic goes everywhere and it will come back.
Are we seeing internationally some momentum building for treaties like the Paris Accords? Like, is there something similar for plastic?
Yeah, I mean, people just developing countries really fighting for it because they don't want to buy another waste management factory in their own tiny island, being sold by somebody like, Japan or United States, if I may say. It shouldn't be that kind of scheme anymore. We just really have to work together and extended producers' responsibility. That's absolutely first step. Absolutely. So EPR, and if people can talk about it, and you guys are already doing great things by being here, so thank you so much. But can I give it back to you? I just get too excited.
That's good. Thanks so much. Should we take some audience questions?
Yes.
Okay, so go to, I think it's slido.com, slido.com, and you can type your question, hit send, and it magically appears here somehow. I don't know who's doing this, but it's coming into a Google Doc for me. And these are great questions. I knew there would be some really interesting questions from the audience. Is there a real chance that we'll be able to use bacteria or fungi to break up plastics at a large scale rather than only attempting to recycle them? Is there some magic bullet here that can save us like a fungi?
Okay, so there are some promising technologies. So there's using enzyme and bacteria, but these are at the lab scale with a small amount of material. The amount of material we have coming in is massive. And to do this, if you went to a recycling facility and watched them, it's a massive amount of stuff. And you can't let it sit for 10 days and wait for it to be degraded. This has to happen quickly. So yes, there may be in 10 years some new technology, but right now, absolutely not.
10 years?
15 years. Anyway, the point is, there could be innovation that comes, so we don't want to deny that. But right now, it is absolutely not feasible.
And it's absolutely cheaper to burn it. Mm-hmm. So they will burn it, and or landfill. Absolutely cheaper. So we'll do it. We'll love to have a bacteria, but it would cost too much. If there is a gap in the regulations, which shouldn't have here, but that they would do it, and we can't blame them, So it's
those economic forces are so powerful, which is where regulation comes in. Great. Well, let's keep going. All right. So, which companies are leading the way in developing better or fewer packaging solutions and paying for them?
Amazon, to their credit, are doing great work around this. And Amazon was at the table in a very positive way, recognizing this was sustainability was a huge company goal, and they wanted to be constructive in the conversation in Olympia. So I would say they're a great example. And again, it's because they're the consumers who use Amazon. We want that. We want less packaging and less boxes and less foam and styrofoam and plastic and all of that. And they recognize not only is it good for the planet, but it's good for their bottom line. So I would say, and then we've had really great partnerships also with other companies.
Yeah, another good local Washington State example is Philips. So the Sonicare toothbrushes used to come in a bunch of plastic and other types of packaging. They completely redesigned their packaging to be all recyclable and less of it. And they designed their toothbrush to have a removable battery. So you can actually replace a battery and keep using it. Like my husband was so frustrated a few years ago because you had to basically buy a new Sonicare toothbrush.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, great. So here's another question from the audience. In the states with ERP or the, responsibility, EPR, okay, producer responsibility programs, this is what similar to what the WRAP Act would have done. Have there been challenges or unintended consequences with implementation of these programs?
Well, so I guess the first part I would say is they're all really new. So they actually haven't, so it's California, Oregon, Maine, and Colorado. And they're all a little different. Maine was first. I'm looking at Heather because she has the knowledge on this. But they haven't really got off the ground yet. So we keep, that's one reason that the industry says, hey, slow down, stop what you're doing. We don't know how these other states are going, so let's keep delay. We shouldn't do anything here until we know. Well, that's not acceptable to me personally. But so what would you say? I mean, they're not really fully implemented yet.
Not in the US, but in Canada, they've been rolling it out over the past 10 years, and British Columbia did the model that we are most similar to, where the manufacturers, which is the brands and the producers, pay for the entire system, 100% pay for it. But other provinces did not. They had partial payment. They all are now changing to that full payment. So that's why our model is the full payment model. So we're looking at the one that in all those sort of experiments in Canada, the British Columbia model was the one to use.
Okay, it looks like the audience wants to take some names here. What companies are the biggest lobbying forces against WRAP Act?
Well, I would say it's mostly the companies themselves hide behind the business associations that they belong to in Olympia, and probably the same things are happening in DC. We had a lot of industries also who, I would say like the medical device industry and other medical industries were very concerned about, the food industry was very concerned about how their packaging would be impacted. Everyone wanted an exemption, and then once you exempt everybody, there's no one left in the program. So I would say that it's a lot of maybe the smaller companies joining together as a part of association saying, this is too scary and too hard and too much change, and we aren't playing in Europe or Canada, so this is scary to us and we don't want to do it here in the United States. I would say, is sort of who was the biggest opposition. And it was pretty powerful, I believe, because the issue is so complicated for legislators and staff to fully digest. It's easier to say no, right, than to say, okay, let's try something different. This sounds scary, but let's try it anyway. So, anything else that you would call out?
Waste Association was the #1 opponent to the bill. And, but to address the issue of the small mom and pop shops in Washington, the threshold is actually $5 million of products sold in Washington, or 1 million tons of packaging. So a little mom and pop one-off shops, they would not be impacted by the law.
I think to piggyback here, there's an interesting question from the audience about the effect of COVID on our use of single-use plastics. I feel like, thinking back now, it feels like a black hole of COVID, but there seemed to have been a lot of momentum behind folks, weaning themselves off of single-use plastics. And I could see how this person is asking about whether or not there was a setback with COVID and how that might set us back. Are we able to overcome how we had backpedaled in that way?
There was a monster setback. So what happened is, right at the beginning of COVID, we were all afraid. We had no idea how it was being transmitted. And the plastics industry sent a letter to President Trump at that point, signed by all these plastic industries, saying that plastics is an essential product and we must have it, and we need to have plastics because that was going to be the safest thing. So there was really a lot of PR that it could be and we didn't know that the COVID could be transmitted by touching things, when it turned out to actually be more of a respiratory thing.
We were wiping our groceries down, and
we were at our
early
mail
COVID
and
times,
right?
Yeah.
We were on a very strong trajectory at that point, right before COVID, of moving to reuse, where people could bring their own bottle, bring your own coffee mug to a coffee shop, that kind of thing. And that all got completely stopped at that point. And now, over the last 3 years, it's regained its momentum. But that was a big blow at that point.
We have another good question. Companies tend to pass the cost to the consumer somehow. How do we ensure that won't happen if we do pass some sort of legislation?
Well, it's a great question. So some studies have been done around this, that basically the bottom line is that EPR systems don't actually pass the cost on to their consumers through the product. And we know this because several studies have been done. So there was a study done in 2020 in Oregon called basket of goods. Am I saying that right? Basket of goods. And they studied just like a basket of goods at the grocery store in Oregon and compared that to several provinces in Canada who have EPR systems, and there was no difference in price. So we know that the price differences we see has to do with inflation or supply chain issues, but that's another myth that the industry, quite honestly, is telling people in power, people who make laws, that their consumers, their constituents might see free recycling bills, but the price of a carton of milk is going to be more expensive for their families. And that's simply not true, and a myth that we need to bust and make sure is not being spread, because they say it like it's fact, and it's not true.
Well, maybe that's kind of surprising for some people to hear, because you think of, the lobbying efforts against the bill, where they're afraid of cost increases and so forth. And if that does come to pass, you may think naturally that some of that cost would be passed down to the consumer to offset the cost of the regulation, right?
Well, I mean, just to respond really quickly, is I think that what happens is they find better ways to package their stuff and stop producing so much of the packaging. That certainly helps their bottom line, because if they're producing less of the packaging, they pay less into the system.
And then in Europe and in Canada, these laws have been in place for a very long time. So all these major corporations, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, most of the stuff that you're getting in your grocery store right now, they're international corporations. We've been paying for that, all of us, for decades if there's this big increase. So the reality is that this is already something that is built into their budget from a long, long time ago.
And it can be very emotional too, right? You were telling me backstage about, I think it was Darigold, where there was discussions over post-consumer content being used for milk jugs, right? What happened there? How did someone, a CEO, perhaps from one of these companies, sort of come to terms with this idea of using more recycled content, and how did they get to that point of like saying, yes, we can make these extra costs for doing this?
So the bill that Senator Dawson, who was formerly in the legislature, and Representative Liz Berry worked on, which was SB 5022 a couple of years ago, was going to require recycled content for beverage containers. The dairy industry, Darigold, was very opposed to being included. And finally, Senator Doss talked to their CEO and talked about the future, our kids or his grandkids, and they came to an agreement to give a 5-year delay for the dairy milk jugs. So in the bill, that's how it got passed into law. That summer in California, all of a sudden, a milk company announced that they were going to be using recycled content. So a lot of these innovations are already kind of in the works with these corporations, and we just need to pass the laws to help make it happen.
You saw this with car manufacturers, where now the shift to electric vehicles is happening very fast. Well, this blinking red dot here is telling me we are officially out of time, and thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for being here to have this discussion with us. Appreciate it.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you to Ben, Heather, Dr. Oda, and Representative Berry for the talk. This episode of Crosscut Talks was produced by Seth Halloran and engineered by Rusty Bacall and Victoria Ralph. And the event was produced by Jake Newman and Ann O'Dowd. Madeline Happold managed our audience engagement. And you can subscribe to Crosscut Talks wherever you listen. And if you like the show, please review us. We want to know what you think. For the latest political, environmental, and cultural news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. And if you would like to support the work we do at Crosscut, whether it's live events we host or the in-depth reporting we do every day, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to on-demand programming on Seattle's PBS station, KCTS 9. Crosscut Talks is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Paris Jackson. We'll be back soon with another conversation.